Welcome to all the people who are joining us for webinar number 231 since the Andean Health Organization Hipólito Unanue Agreement started a webinar cycle in May 2020. It has been 4 years of continuous learning. Today, we are pleased to present the webinar Different Generations Working Together. In 1971, with the creation of the Hipólito Unanue Agreement, the governments of Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela joined together with a sense of solidarity and regional integration to make health a bridge for peace and work for well-being. Thus, today, the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unanue Agreement, has an important trajectory of unity and constant work with the ministries of health of the 6 Andean countries towards the realization of the right to health. In the midst of technological globalization, the COVID-19 pandemic reaffirmed the relevance of the health sector for life with well-being. For this reason, it is now a priority to keep health at the center of policies and social awareness to unite for the common good in order to advance in a society that cares for life. Health is the bridge to integration and peace. For this reason, in the Strategic Plan for Integration in Health 2023-2030 of Horace Conhu, we argue to ensure the full realization of the right to health with social and environmental justice, it is key to work intensively in strengthening health systems, emphasizing primary health care. Reflections such as this can be found in the Noti Salud Andina's newsletter, monthly edition, which we invite you to read and which is available in our website and in the Andean Integration Knowledge Showcase. We invite you to leave your name, organization, and country in the comment box of the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chat. In the same space, you can leave your questions or send them via email to webinarshorasconju@gmail.com. To access the certificate of attendance in any of the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chats, you will find a fixed link where you will have to fill a short survey and leave your data. Please verify that your email address is spelled correctly to send the certificate, which will be sent to your email address in the following week. In this webinar, we will follow the usual dynamics. We will start with the institutional greeting, followed by the keynote dissertations, and then a dialogue based on the questions asked by the participants in the different platforms. To begin this important day, I will give the floor to Dr. Maria del Carmen Cae, Executive Secretary of the Andean Health Organization, who will give the welcome and institutional greeting. Go ahead, dear Dr. Cae. Thank you very much, Yadi. Well, my opening words from Cartagena. We are attending at the 5th ECLAC meeting. Very happy to mention a few words before starting this webinar. Warm greetings to everyone from wherever you are joining us in this important webinar, Different Generations Working Together, with the objective of exploring the interaction and mutual support between different generations in the promotion of health and well-being. In an ever-changing world where generational diversity is increasingly evident, it is essential, because this is the first time the 5 generations are working together, it is essential to understand the relationships, interactions, and dynamics between the different generations. The Andean Policy on Human Resources in Health to 2030, in its line of action 2, Objective 2.2, rightly recognizes this by emphasizing the importance of considering the needs and characteristics of each generation within health teams. Approaching health from an intergenerational approach allows us to recognize the unique strengths and perspectives that each generation brings. By fostering supervisory styles that are sensitive to generational differences, we can promote greater cohesion and effectiveness in interprofessional health teams, taking full advantage of the wealth of knowledge and experience that each member has to offer. It is important to emphasize that the concept of intergenerational goes beyond simple age categorization. Today, age is not an infallible indicator of a person's desires, interests, feelings, strengths, and perceptions. In fact, the coexistence of 5 generations at the same time requires us to rethink the idea of ageism and embrace intergenerational solidarity. Between people of different generations, it becomes a fundamental pillar for progress. At this moment, as I mentioned, the 5th meeting of ECLAC is on, and it insists on the intergenerational solidarity as a key aspect of sustainable development, essential to approach issues such as aging of the population and the knowledge transference and resources between or among generations. In this webinar, we will have the valuable presence of outstanding professionals. Dr. Matthew Kaplan, professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the USA, who will share his experiences in networking and international development of intergenerational programs. And the sociologist Ernesto Rodriguez, director of the Latin American Center on Youth, who will give us a deep look at the intergenerational perspectives in health policies. I'm sure that this webinar will be a valuable opportunity to deepen our understanding of the international approach and strengthen our skills to work together with people of all ages, promoting a culture of collaboration, respect, and mutual learning. We invite you to actively participate in this space of dialogue and reflection, where together we will build a healthier and more equitable future for all generations. Because from the Andean Health Organization Hipólito Unanue Agreement, we are fully convinced that together we're stronger and together we will go even further. Thank you very much and welcome. Thank you, dear Dr. Calle. After the greeting of our Executive Secretary, I introduce myself. My name is Yadira Salas. I'm a technopedagogue, coordinator of the Andean Committee of Human Resources in Health in the Andean Health Organization, and today I will be in charge of moderating this webinar with great pleasure. So to start with the presentations, we would like to cordially welcome Dr. Matthew Kaplan. Dr. Kaplan is professor of intergenerational programs in aging at Penn State University and is based in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education. He has published numerous works advancing the field, focusing on intergenerational programs and practices from an interdisciplinary and cross-cultural perspective. Published books include Intergenerational Touch Zones, Place-Based Strategies for promoting social inclusion and belonging, evidence-based strategies, intergenerational pathways to a sustainable society, connecting lives, a global vision of intergenerational exchange, and the role of intergenerational programs in supporting children, youth, and elderly in Japan. Dr. Kaplan holds a PhD in environmental psychology from the New York University Graduate Center and was a visiting professor at the Oxford Institute of Population Aging and a Fulbright Senior Scholar studying intergenerational initiatives in Japan. Welcome, Dr. Kaplan. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Yadira, and thank you, Dr. Calle, for the invitation, and also Jorge Lemke for translating. My Spanish is very poor, almost non-existent, so thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, so I'll dive right in. Oops. Sorry. I'll try one more time. Okay, so let me dive right in. This is my title of my talk here. There's a lot to cover in a half an hour. Networks, that's a big topic in intergenerational work, international development, and so forth. But I'll try to tie it all together, talking about the growing prevalence of intergenerational work across countries and how the field has evolved, some trends, and then also focusing in on globalization of the field, as well as empowerment and other principles and key themes, also networks, a lot of examples of those. And of course, I'll talk about intergenerational living as a full paradigm. So first, from my experience, having been fortunate enough to work with colleagues, intergenerational studies colleagues, in about 10 countries over the years, I would say that this field of inquiry and practice is really thriving. So the challenge is that when you go into a different country with sometimes different languages, almost always, the terminology is different. So when I was able to study intergenerational work in Japan, had a Fulbright to do so, 1994 to 95, I asked about their programs, intergenerational work, and I was told they had none. But then when we did a survey, we found 50 right away. So we just have to be aware that there's different terminology, different languages, different understanding of intergenerational work. But generally, it is quite, growing incredibly. When I started working in this field, late 80s, we almost had to beg people to let us go into their school or senior center or community organization do intergenerational work. Now it's integrated into just about every field, every discipline, cross-sectorally that I could think of. At any rate, if we're going to look at intergenerational work from an international perspective, we probably should note some universal aspects, like what we'll see in common, and also some variation across national and cultural contexts. In terms of commonalities, I think in every country that's embracing intergenerational methods for improving quality of life for all generations, there's a need to train staff. So how would the facilitator make sure that the younger and older generations involved, and the generations in the middle, of course, can be interacting and engaging in authentic kinds of ways? So training is really important. Some clarity of objectives is key. Sometimes people are brought together and they're sitting together, but not really engaging. So, it's kind of an art and a science. All right. So one other thing we see in common is that people don't jump up and down with excitement around the word intergenerational. including for funders. What people tend to find exciting is related to the value that an intergenerational framework or paradigm adds to address, I guess, solving problems and meeting challenges, improving quality of life. So here is just a bunch of bullets on different areas in terms of applications of intergenerational work. So for each one of these, there are probably a million pages of text on innovation, research, application. Maybe a million's exaggerating. I'd say at least a couple of 100,000. But yeah, it's exploding intergenerational work, in all these different contexts. And when I start talking about trends in the field, to think less in terms of separate silos or different tracks of intergenerational work, to actually see how it all fits together as kind of an intergenerational way of life, intergenerational living. So that's one of the things, one of the points I like to emphasize over and over. Okay, so all right, so some similarities and differences. I mean, a universal aspect is everybody has a story to tell. They have experience, and part of being included and feeling a sense of belonging in one's community, in one's country, in the world, and even in one's skin. I mean, there has to be a feeling that one's experience is legitimate and deserves to be told. What varies across countries and cultures is opportunities to tell these stories to others. So when we really hear the narratives of people who work with highly socially, I guess, distanced people who are lonely, really far away from natural interaction with others, there's a lot of pain to knowing that they have value to add and provide to other people's lives through experience, through their stories, but yet not many opportunities to share. So that's part of what we train people in culturally appropriate ways to help create culturally appropriate ways for people to tell their stories. And when we look at intergenerational work, there are many, as I mentioned before, there are many ways in which these initiatives have been developed. Here we see images related to how people eat, how people shop and eat, and basically work together as families to eat healthfully, to exercise, to share memories, to talk about the environment, to study science, to express arts and science. Here in the bottom right, we have an intergenerational dance studio in an event we did in Pittsburgh. The top of the right has a young adult, a teenager actually, a 4-H member who was visiting with her club, an assisted living facility, and didn't know how to break the ice. So a good facilitator, a volunteer in her club, said, "Why don't you bring your pet?" Here we see a miniature horse coming with her, and right away they zeroed in and talked about the pet and then started sharing stories. So that's very important to figure that out. What do people care about, and how do you bridge the interaction? Transmitting cultural heritage is really key. So, of course, each culture has its own heritage and traditions and history. So passing it on from generation to generation, that's a huge domain of value for this kind of work. Also to help people feel a sense of cultural identity and pride. There we're talking about intergenerational, intracultural passing on of knowledge and values. And also across countries, we see some variation in what people share and across different media, different arts, songs, crafts, stories, games, and so forth. Very rich field. We see basically in different countries, intergenerational initiatives, again, intracultural, promoting intracultural understanding and belonging, which is really key for people to know where they came from, but also bridging different cultures is really very important. I'll just keep going kind of quickly. And again, there needs to be some kind of object or some kind of purpose, some kind of experience that they can focus on and share their respective experiences and how they look at things and so forth. Here's an image from a park in the Netherlands. As a intergenerational specialist, realized that there was some tension between local youth and recent immigrants from Turkey. So people didn't realize what they had in common. So after a lot of discussion groups and so forth, realized they all like to play, and they had different ideas of how to play with tops, how to create tops. So they found out that this older Turkish gentleman was really, really creative and masterful, almost as an engineer in building tops. So they played his game, and then he started playing their game. So sharing toys, sharing culture is a very important aspect, especially globally and in this time of misunderstanding and potential conflict and actual conflict around the world. How do we know the other? How do we care about the other? In fact, people in the Netherlands have a saying, unknown equals unloved. I don't know the actual language of it, but okay. Some trends in the field. So over time, there's been just even with my own experience from the late 80s on, there's been a broadening of definitions and ways of framing intergenerational phenomena. When I started, everybody was talking about short-term programs and activities, but over time, we started seeing people talk about community development. Architects, landscape architects, geographers came in and they were talking about how do we create settings that are conducive to bringing people together. And of course, anthropologists talking about cultural continuity and so forth. And then we have some policy people as well. How do we create policies to create programs in places where people can actually be together, learn with and from one another, and provide care with and from provide care for one another, the circle of care throughout the lifespan. So I'll be talking about globalization a bit in future slides here, and somewhat about the emphasis on participatory processes. That's been growing over time. The realization that the best programs actually get the voice of the participants up front, rather than the facilitator arbitrarily deciding the context in which people are going to talk about. And also it's being seen as a field of inquiry and practice, where inquiry and practice kind of merge. And as far as growing the field in the future, networks and other information and resource exchange systems, I'll be emphasizing that as well. We have new publication venues, the Journal of Intergenerational Studies. We have our own journal. There are conferences all over the place, local, statewide, national, international. And more and more, they're bridging disciplines. Actually, we have a conference here next week. I have a slide on that. If anybody happens to find themselves in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that would be great. We'll invite you. All right, also training programs. There are training programs in many countries. Internationally, we see them, University of Granada in Scotland, US with Generations United, all kinds of training programs designed to train not only the facilitators, but also stakeholders, funders, talking about how do we build local capacity for innovation in terms of creating intergenerational initiatives that can actually improve quality of life. And also we're seeing international study and learn experiences. So a couple of years ago, I had the chance to take a group of Pennsylvania State University students to Spain for a couple of weeks to learn about their intergenerational work. And we were hosted by University of Granada. My friend and colleague, Mariano Sanchez, who's the Macrosad Chair in Intergenerational Studies, also Dean, faculty in Political Sciences and Sociology at that university, was kind of host and helped us really get a feeling what was going on, visit many cities and towns doing great intergenerational work in Spain. So I have a couple of minute, 90-second video here I'd like to show that one of our students just did on her free time during this. I mean, she was just taking shots with her camera, and all of a sudden she produced this amazing video. Okay, so here we go.
When we were younger, we thought everyone was on our side. Then we grew a little and romanticized the time I saw flowers in your hair. 'Cause it takes a boy to live, it takes a man to pretend he was there. So then we grew a little and knew a lot, and now we demonstrated it to the cops and all the things we said. We were self-assured, 'cause it's a long road to wisdom, but it's a short one to being ignored. Be in my eyes, be in my heart, be in my eyes, be in my heart. So now I think that I could love you back, and I hope it's not too late, 'cause you're so attractive and the way you move, I won't close my eyes. 'Cause it takes a man to live, it takes a woman to make him compromise. So be in my eyes, be in my heart, be in my eyes, be in my heart.
Okay. So whenever I listen to that, it kind of lifts me up. Just the energy of it all. And these students were studying intergenerational work in the US, and to see how it's taking off in different ways, in culturally appropriate ways in Spain. And even the Spanish speakers, those who spoke Spanish, they learned stuff about the language. Like when we went into the mountains of Extremadura, and found out that there were all these different dialects, and they had a program of older adults teaching younger adults these dialects, and using these long tubes to actually say the word slowly, and share poetry. I mean, it was so rich, and it expanded our horizons about doing intergenerational work in our own countries. Okay, so I would guess I'll have a couple of questions on that. But one of the other really nice developments is emphasis on participatory process. I was touching base on that earlier. So empowerment, intergenerational work really is about empowering people across the age continuum to have voice in the programs that are developed for them to learn, for them to provide care for others, for them to have a say in how parks and other community sites are developed. So across the field, it's really important to recognize that the generations should be working together, that civic engagement opportunities should be age integrated, or at least have that option, because people smell the same air. They live in the same house, under the same roofs. So they need to not only say what they want based on their generational perspectives, but to listen and also find ways to come up with integrative ideas or solutions to challenges, which they could come to find helps them not only express what they want to see and learn about others, but find what's great for both. Find communities that work for all ages, all family members and neighbors and so forth. All right, I probably spent too much time on that. So getting to talking about intergenerational networks. So basically, we could boil it down to 4 large functions that networks offer. We see great programs come and go. They're almost like snowflakes in some cases. When funding runs out or some key person changes jobs. So networks are so good for sharing information and ideas, coming up with ways to sustain and grow the knowledge base through conferences and websites and repositories and so forth. So important because there's so much good work that's been done over the last 30 years or 35, even maybe 40 years in this field. And people, no, we don't want everybody struggling to invent the wheel again. and also finding common ground across disciplines and also sectors as far as how to enrich intergenerational living agendas. I'm going to focus mostly on a few examples of how intergenerational networks actually can function as vision enablers, helping people who do this kind of work be more ambitious and actually do more than they could do or think about doing on their own. So I started talking about like websites and so forth. Here are a bunch of other ways in which networks accomplish the objectives I just talked about. Keeping a database, conferences. I was very big on demonstration projects with the networks I've been involved with. New York State, Hawaii, Pennsylvania, so statewide networks there. I worked with some folks in Japan to help them establish their national network. So signature projects, training workshops, community forums, and so forth, awards programs. So there are many, many different tools depending on the amount of support and organizational structures and the how motivated the members of a network are to make it something special and strong. I like the saying, all of us are smarter than any of us. Some people feel they're better off alone, competing for grants, and they feel they could get funded. But actually, there are many, many benefits to when you have funding systems that actually foreground the goal in terms of making decisions of who gets funded. They look at collaboration. They look at different members and different organizations contributing different parts of the research or the and/or practice. Anyway, so how to bring organizations together where the teamwork leverages everyone's skills, interests, and resources is key. An example from Hawaii Intergenerational Network, been involved in that since the late 80s. I was at Hawaii Pacific University. We started that network. And just in recent years, they came up with this tremendously ambitious program. And it's not even a program, it's an initiative, Home Sharing Hawaii. So it was recognized that there's a housing shortage. There's a shortage of affordable housing in Hawaii in many places. So you have a lot of older adults who are living in large houses. They're house rich, but yet socially isolated and also financially challenged in many cases. And then you have college students and young adults who basically, they're house poor and resource poor, struggled. So the idea of this system to make matches between people who have houses with space and rooms to rent or negotiate different services and people who need a place to live and they want to connect and they don't want to be living on their own. So Home Sharing Hawaii, you could look it up. This is the website. You could check it out. It's a very inspiring kind of program. And we see how people are helping each other. We call this help with top shelf interaction. Okay. Oh, now here's an example of an intergenerational program that has implications for health beyond the initial emphasis. So this was a program that began in Wisconsin. It was a Meals on Wheels program designed, I'm sure in many of your countries and communities you have programs like this, to bring healthy food to people who are isolated, socially isolated, and either struggling with mobility issues, economic issues, and so forth. So there's a meals program and like that in Wisconsin, but the people there in that program just realized that it's not just giving them nutrition, that they're also suffering from being socially isolated, which we know is really bad for health and even contributes to premature mortality. So they figured out a way. It was in this area that was next to a state park, lots of birds and nature and so forth. They figured out a way to facilitate social context. They put packets of bird seeds along with a bird identification sheet inside on the, like not inside the food, but on the side of the food that they delivered. And it's usually young people delivering the food. Then the people who were isolated, they'd read these, they'd see the packets, and they a lot of them went outside to see how it worked. What kind of birds can they identify and attract? And then their neighbors would see, hey, I see you're checking out the birds. Well, I know something about birds. And they would start talking and even picking up a hobby, maybe even a hobby interest group. So they loved it. And there was low technology. But this is the kind of thing, bringing together people from many fields, including ornithologists, people who study birds, nutrition educators, parks development, just so many different disciplines, people from different disciplines, all for the idea of health, preventive health, mental health, physical health. So that kind of thinking, we see that interorganizational teamwork coming when people get to know each other from different organizations, usually as parts of networks. So for networks to be successful, you need active members. And certainly you want, in terms of funding and organizational development, we know some networks have died out after, a singular funder finds something else to fund. So, one of the good things to do is get funded and support from different agencies. And you need a solid group. So our Pennsylvania Intergenerational Network, moving to that, we've gotten increasingly ambitious because not because people like myself helped to start this, want to get ambitious, but the members keep pushing us. 2 years ago, we did a statewide conference and we launched the network. And then they started saying, well, gee, we did local stuff. We did statewide stuff. Why don't we do mid-Atlantic states? There's 7 states around Pennsylvania towards the east and south and west of it. So we have a conference coming up next week. And right on this page, there's a link to it, but I'm going to keep going. I just want to just have a few minutes left. I don't want to go over time. And I guess my question is, we worked up to an agreement that, yeah, intergenerational studies is a field, but I'm thinking we want to move to the next piece of awareness, which is when can it be considered a movement, and not just for a lot of silos like intergenerational learning or intergenerational arts and recreation or something like that, but intergenerational living. Not where everybody has to do intergenerational things every moment of life, but that they have options to engage, to learn new skills, to share what they know, to go on walking tours, eat together, and so forth. So that's really what I'm hoping we see more of, right? So I don't know how that got in there. On my slides, and we have a PDF file, a bunch of resources from Penn State that we've developed. Oh, it's Penn State University, not University of Pennsylvania. I just want to clarify. We're the land-grant school. And they're an Ivy League school, but good for them. Okay, anyway, so this is my contact information. Feel free to contact me anytime. And, oh wait, sorry, this is an old slide. This is the best way to contact me. And thank you so much. I think I made it within a half an hour. I hope I didn't go too fast, Jorge. I didn't really pause much.
No, you were great. Thank you.
Interpreter. Thank you, Jorge. And thank you, Yadira and Dr. Calle again. Look forward to your questions and conversation after we hear from Dr. Rodriguez.
Rodriguez.
Así es. Muchísimas gracias, estimado Dr. Matthew. Interesante
Thank you, Dr.
disertación.
Matthew. Interesting presentation,
De su
highlighting
disertación que la
from your
colaboración
presentation
internacional
that
está en auge
intergenerational
pero
conversation
nuestra
is
historia
thriving
hay
worldwide,
una
but as you
mención
mentioned, it varies in this
compartimos
reach.
desafíos comunes,
Although
la
we share
historia, la
common
importancia de
challenges,
entre
the
culturas,
history and
no los compartimos
differs
de
between
manera
cultures, as you
muy dinámica y
very dynamically and
También
didactically
destacamos los
shared.
programas
We also
intergeneracionales
highlighted that
buscan responder
intergenerational
a
programs
problemas reales
seek to respond to
involucradores a
real
individuos,
problems and improve the
abarcando
quality of
desde la
life,
salud hasta la educación y
encompassing
la
health,
transformación.
education, and
Y
cultural
compartir
transmission.
historias e intercambios
And to
de
share
información
stories
es
and
fundamental para
between
encontrar
generations is
puntos en
fundamental
común.
to find those points in
Para
common.
resaltar, además,
And to
que
highlight
las redes de
also
trabajo
that the
intergeneracional
intergenerational
facilitan el
networks facilitate the exchange of ideas, collaboration, and promotion of a shared agenda. So, dear Dr. Kaplan, please stay in the room. We have many comments and questions that we will consider at the end of this webinar. Now we have the following dissertation, and we would like to welcome Dr. Ernesto Rodriguez, international consultant. He's a sociologist from Uruguay and director of the Latin American Center on Youth, created in 1986. He has been working for more than 40 years as a researcher and teacher in the design and evaluation of policies, plans, programs, and projects in education, employment, health, violence prevention, and social development, focused on children, adolescents, and youth, with a gender, generational, and ethnic perspective in all Latin American countries. He was director of the National Youth Institute of Uruguay and chairman of the Ibero-American Youth Organization. He currently works as an international consultant. As a consultant of the Andean Health Organization, he has carried out studies such as social inequalities in health, baselines for a transforming recovery, the syndemia associated with COVID-19 and the rights of children and adolescents in Latin America, which can be found on our webpage of the Andean Health Organization. Go ahead, dear Ernesto. You have the floor. Welcome. Thank you, Yadira. It's a pleasure to be sharing this space with you. Thank you to the Horas CONU for the invitation, to Mari Carmen for her trust and the link that we have for so long in all these mentioned areas. Thank you for having included in this webinar series as such an important topic. It is of great relevance. And to say that in personal and professional terms, I started 17 years ago working in topics with youth, now in 70 years, so you can realize I'm not that young. And I have life experiences going through different stages in this life course that we all have with our own trajectories. And today I can see with more emphasis what in some fields of social science we talk about the age sociologies, although we are not really happy with this idea of staying in the topic of ages, as Dr. Calle mentioned during her opening words. I would like to mention that the approach that I want to give to my presentation is focused on the promotion of intergenerational dialogues, although there's a lot of divisions of the intergenerational in each one of the could be used for another webinar. And I would like to do it starting from inequalities and from the problems that intergenerational relationships have, and to see how the response was, is, and will be in promoting dialogue between generations and the interrelationships also. With focus on Latin America, of course, which I know more. You need to haven't started sharing my presentation yet. So I would like to focus on these countries. So, we can talk about of what I know, or what has been my experience, both in terms of research and design of program and projects, and also the evaluations and my experience in Latin America on all these decades. In that regard, I have tried to gather in my presentation
esta idea de que
this idea
plantearse como objetivo
that
la
we need
supervisión
to
de los diálogos intergeneracionales.
promote
Volver a tener,
intergenerational dialogues in Latin
asumiendo que estamos
America,
ante desafíos
assuming
complejos,
that
la
we are in
construcción de
complex
futuros comunes,
situations to build
inclusivos,
common futures that are
democráticos,
inclusive,
y
democratic,
sostenibles, porque
and sustainable,
de eso es que efectivamente se
because
trata en
that
más
is what is
de un sentido.
what we're talking about in this
Para
sense.
ello yo quisiera partir
And
de
for
un
that, I would like to
un
start
marco conceptual muy básico
from a
que voy a tratar
basic
muy
conceptual
rápidamente,
framework
diciendo que estamos
stating that
más que en una época de cambios,
we're more in an
un
epoch
cambio
of
de
change.
época muy
We're in a
fuerte
change
en
of
el mundo
epoch,
y en particular
strong change in this world, in particular in Latin America,
cada uno de nuestros países.
and specifically in our
Tenemos,
countries.
felizmente, muchos,
And fortunately, we have
intelectuales y
many
especialistas
intellectuals,
que nos han ido mostrando las grandes
especially that
dimensiones
have shown us the dimensions of this
y algunos autores
change.
que
I mentioned some
mucho,
authors that I
quienes
do
ya
follow
se
a lot.
en otros webinars, saben que recurro muy a menudo
You
a
know
estos
that I
autores,
always use this type of authors
que nos hablan de que estamos en una
who
época
talk
de
that we are
pasiones,
in an
en una
age
era
of
del
sad
individuo
passions,
tirano,
in the age of the tyrant individual,
en particular en torno a
in
lo que
particular
es,
in terms of
que se ha ido instalando como
what
la tiranía
has
del
been
mérito.
called as the tyranny of merit.
En ese marco, algunos autores nos han
In that
planteado
frame,
cuánto
some
vale
author
una
have
vida.
proposed how much is a life
Otros
is
nos han
worth. Others
hecho
have
llamados de atención muy fuertes sobre
called
que
our
la
attention
desigualdad
about
mata.
that inequality
Estoy
skill,
refiriendo, obviamente, a François
talking
Doblet,
about
a
Eric
Michel
Saden,
Sandel, a Dieter
Michael
Facin,
Sandel,
a Goran Terborn.
Facen,
Creo que eso es
Goran
realmente
Thurborn,
muy
and
relevante
this
desde todo
is
punto
quite
de vista.
relevant from
Quizás como
every
un solo
point of view.
ejemplo
Perhaps as a single
de
example
estos temas que deberíamos
of these topics
trabajar
that
mucho más a
we
fondo,
should work
quisiera
in more
compartirles
depth,
solamente una
I
frase
would like
del
to
primero
share
de
a
los autores
phrase
citados,
from the
François
first
Doblet,
of the
cuando dice
authors,
que
from
vivimos en una
Duvet, that says
época de pasiones
that
tristes.
we live
Nos
in
dice lo
an
siguiente: emociones
epoch
como
of
la
sad
ira,
passions.
la
Yet emotions such as
indignación,
anger,
el
indignation,
resentimiento
and resentment
atraviesan las redes sociales
run
y la opinión
through
de los
social networks
televisivos.
and the opinion of
Ese
television
enojo
panelists.
toma
This anger
la forma de la
takes the
denuncia y
form
la
of
catarsis por un
denunciation or
orden que se siente
catharsis of
injusto
an order
y
that is
suele
felt to be
encarnizarse con los
unjust
que reciben
and is
asistencia
often
del Estado,
incarnated in those
todos
who
unos
receive assistance from
pero
the
también
state,
con
all
con
useless,
los políticos
but
y las
also with
élites
politicians and
todos
elites, all corrupt.
Aquí, acá y allá,
Here
un
and
lenguaje
there,
paranoico
a paranoid
acusa a los
language
pobres,
accuses
los
the poor,
inmigrantes,
the
los
immigrants,
desempleados por no
and the
esforzarse lo
unemployed for not
suficiente,
trying hard enough,
a las finanzas por hacer negocios a
finance for
costa de la
doing
seguridad
business at the
nacional,
expense of national
y a
economies,
estas por no abrirse a
and
la
the latter for not
globalización,
opening up to
a los gobiernos
globalization,
por desmantelar las
governments for
políticas
dismantling
sociales, o
social
al
policies,
contrario, por
or on
abusar
the
de ellas
contrary, for abusing
demagógicamente.
them
Cada
demagogically.
uno tiene razones para
Everyone
sentirse
has
abandonado,
reasons to
amenazado,
feel abandoned,
y para
threatened,
sospechar que el
and to
otro,
suspect that the
cualquier
other,
otro,
any
recibe
other,
ventajas
is receiving
indebidas.
undue
Creo que
advantages.
efectivamente
I think
ese
that indeed there
excelente
is
resumen de
an excellent summary
estado de situación,
of this state of the situation,
de cómo estamos, digamos,
of how we're doing
en nuestro planeta,
in
podríamos
our
decir,
planet,
actualmente con todas las especificidades que tiene
presently
cada
with all the
rincón de ese
specificities
planeta.
in each corner of
Esta
that
idea
planet.
del
This
individuo
idea
tirano es otra
of the
constante,
tyrant
otra
individual is
perspectiva
also
muy importante.
another important
La idea de que
perspective.
casi todo se plantea
The
desde
idea that
las
almost
esferas
everything
individuales,
is
que
proposed in
nuestro
terms of
marco, el
individual
mérito es un marco
efforts,
fundamental,
and that merit is a fundamental value,
y
and,
que pasa por encima
and
de
it
las
goes
desigualdades de base, digamos.
on top
Entonces,
of the
no
baseline
sirve
inequalities.
necesariamente igualdad de oportunidades para
So there's
decir, bueno,
equal
todo es
opportunities
base,
to say, well, on that
es todo en
basis,
base a méritos, y en
only
realidad
based on merits, and
situaciones
actually that hides
muy diferentes en
different
todos los aspectos.
situations in every aspect.
Joseph Stiglitz, un
Joseph
brillante
Stiglitz,
economista
a brilliant
estadounidense,
economist
advirtió que
from the US, has
por más que
mentioned
un niño que nace
that
en contexto
a
de
child
pobreza
who's
se
born
esfuerce,
with
va a seguir
poverty
siendo,
makes an
va a
effort
seguir siendo
will
pobre,
still continue to be
que un
poor,
niño que
and that a
nace
child
y crece en un
who is
hogar
born and thrives
de clases
in a
altas,
higher
de
class
más
home
que suficientes,
with
etcétera, va a
sufficient
seguir
income
siendo rico
is going to
a pesar de
continue
que
to
pueda
be
ser,
rich
por muy
despite
estúpido que
that,
sea, dice,
or
va a seguir
no
siendo
matter
pobre.
how stupid he or she may
Creo que
be.
allí hay una
And I think that
juicio
there
aplastante
is
respecto a que
a
las condiciones de
judgment
mérito
in
son
terms
muy
that these
distintas según
issues
el
of
punto de
merit
partida,
are
evidentemente.
different depending on the starting point.
Facer nos habla de,
And
plantea justamente
Facin
también en ese sentido de
talks out,
esto en el campo
tells
de la
us,
salud es muy importante,
and this is in the
cuánto
field
vale
of
una
health, is
vida.
very important, how much a
Nos
life
advierte
is
sobre la
worth.
idea de que hay
And he warns
diferencias
us
muy
of the idea
sustanciales
that there are very substantial
en cómo se
differences
valoran
in terms of how we value life
desde las distintas perspectivas que
from the
existen
different perspectives that we have here,
y diferencia lo que llaman las vidas
and
biológicas
differences
de las
what we
vidas
call the
biográficas.
biological life from biographical life, in
Necesidad
the sense
imperiosa
that
de no tomarse
there
las
is a
cosas
need
solamente
of
como
not
cuestión
taking this
meramente
such
biológica,
just as a
sino como
biological
recorrido de las
issue, but
trayectorias, las
also
oportunidades,
the
los
trajectories,
esfuerzos,
opportunities,
obstáculos,
efforts,
etcétera, que cada
and
uno tiene
obstacles
para valorar
that
el
each one
presente de
has
la vida de cada quien.
to value the life of each
Una
other.
afirmación tajante que nos hace ver
And
claro
the statement
que la
made by
desigualdad no
Goran
como
Ferban
símbolo
that
de enfermedad
inequality is
blanca,
killed,
sino
it's
como
another
razón necesaria
important
porque
issue for those of
algunas
us who work in
afirmaciones es
health,
justamente
because
uno
it's
de los
telling that
grandes problemas
precisely
que se
one of the
enfrentan las
major
políticas
problems
en general
that
y por
health
extensión
policies face
las
in general,
vinculadas
by
con la
definition,
mortalidad.
is topics related to
Este
mortality.
filósofo sueco nos llama la atención sobre
The
un
Swedish
factor
author
central
tells us that a central factor that has incidence in mortality is precisely in inequalities.
Por eso, en este enfoque
That
que yo
is
quiero
why
plantear
in this
y compartir
approach
con
that I
todos
would like to
ustedes,
propose and share
la
with
idea
you,
es que, tal como
the
hemos
idea
demostrado en
is
otros
that
estudios anteriores que se han
similar to
mencionado,
previous studies that I've mentioned in the
del trabajo de Horace Cohn,
context of the Horace Cohn work,
aquí asumo una
here
definición
I
que me parece
assume
muy
a
relevante
definition
en
that
este
I think that
contexto.
is very
La
relevant
idea
in
de que
this regard. The
existen
idea
múltiples
that there are
inequidades
multiple and
desigualdades
accumulative
de ingresos,
inequalities
étnicas,
in terms of
territoriales,
income, gender,
pero
ethnicity,
también
territories,
intergeneraciones,
and also between generations.
como otro concepto
And that
fundamental.
as another
La
fundamental
idea es
concept,
que estas son
the idea is
acumulativas,
that
esto es,
these are
en
cumulative.
una misma persona.
In the
Puede
same
coincidir el hecho
person,
de que
you
yo,
can
mujer,
coincide the fact
pobre,
that it's a
indígena,
woman,
que
poor,
habita en un territorio
indigenous,
olvidado de nuestros
who lives
países,
in a forgotten territory of
y
our
que,
country,
bueno, en todo caso,
and that
está afectada de
is
manera
being
múltiple y
affected
acumulativa por
in
todas
multiple
estas
and cumulative
desigualdades.
ways by all these
Por tanto, la idea
inequalities.
básica de que
And
no se
therefore, the
pueden
basic idea
atacar
that
cada una
we cannot
de esas
tackle each
desigualdades
of
por
these
encima de una
differences
sola, que hay que
because
tratarlo
in
en
itself
contextos
would
más
have to work
interseccionales,
in
un
intersectional
concepto,
terms.
un enfoque, una mirada que nos han aportado los
An
movimientos
approach
feministas, que creo que
given by the feminist
importante para
movement, which I
todas
think is very
las acciones que
important
hagamos en cualquier
for the
ámbito en ese sentido,
things we do
resulta
in
fundamental
any
para
area
poder avanzar en
and are
este tema.
fundamental to cover this
Dicho
type of
esto,
issues. Having
también
said
hay
so,
que
I will
también
say
sumarle a esto
that we need to
un
add
marco contextual, digamos,
a
analizando
context
los
framework by
principales
analyzing
demográficas en
the
nuestros
most
países.
important
El
demographic
documento que está a
trends.
consideración ahora
The
es un documento
document
justamente
that's
de
been under
la Organización
consideration
de
at this
Progreso y
moment
Desarrollo en América
in this
Latina, a la que nos hacía
meeting
referencia
of
la doctora
ECLAC
Calle,
that Dr.
es muy
Kaye mentioned,
explícito en la
very explicit
identificación de los
in
grandes problemas que tenemos
identification
en
of the
materia
major
de
problems that we
inequidad y los
have
grandes
in
desafíos
these
que tenemos
issues and the
enfrentados.
major challenges.
Nos dice, por ejemplo,
Tells us
cómo se han logrado
how
ciertos avances y siguen
some
faltando
progress
muchas
has been made
limitaciones en el campo de la natalidad,
in the
la
field of
fertilidad, las
birth
migraciones,
rate,
la
fertility,
mortalidad, etcétera,
migration, mortality,
definiciones o áreas centrales de cualquier análisis demográfico.
definitions for any
Han habido
demographic
cambios
analysis,
importantes en
that there have been
distintos órdenes de
important
edades,
changes in
géneros,
the age structure,
que eso
gender,
ha
and
implicado
demographic
cambios
change
demográficos muy fuertes. Vamos a ver algunos de ellos
that are being quite
enseguida.
strong, and we're going to see some of them shortly.
Hay una necesidad imperiosa de
There's a need to
digamos,
reinforce,
de poder ampliar y profundizar los esfuerzos que se vienen
expand
desarrollando
the
en el
efforts
campo de la
made
población
in the
vinculado con
fields of
el desarrollo
population
sostenible e
related
igualitario
to
de
sustainable
derechos
and
humanos
equitable
y derechos
development
humanos.
in terms of human
Eso
rights.
implica que hay que
And that
plantearse
requires that we need
áreas,
to
algunas áreas
consider
específicas
some
en los derechos y
specific
necesidades
areas
y
in terms
demandas en
of
la
rights,
adolescencia y
needs, and
adolescencia,
demands in
el
childhood and
envejecimiento de las
adolescence,
poblaciones,
aging,
protección social,
social
derechos humanos
protection,
para
and
los
human rights
mayores,
of the elderly.
y también en algunas áreas
And also in some areas
en términos temáticos,
that are
acceso universal
specific
a
in
servicios
terms of universal
reproductivos,
access to sexual and
las
reproductive
desigualdades
health services,
territoriales, la movilidad
territorial
social,
inequalities,
las
spatial
vulnerabilidades en particular,
mobility and vulnerability,
temas centrales como los
important topics
que involucran a los
such as those who involve indigenous peoples,
interculturalidad y los derechos humanos,
interculturality and human rights in these cases,
afrodescendientes,
the Afro-descendant
miradas
populations
y en
in
términos
terms of their rights
hay
and
que reafirmar y ampliar los esfuerzos en materia del combate al racismo
combating
y de discriminación.
racism and discrimination.
Yo creo que eso es muy
I
relevante
think
desde todo punto
that's
de
quite
vista.
relevant.
Podríamos aportar cifras en
We
cada
could
caso,
provide
pero yo quisiera
figures
destacar
for each case,
simplemente
but I would like to
dos.
just highlight
Por un lado,
two.
esta que les voy a compartir
On one hand,
ahora,
this one that I'm going to share
que es
now, which
la
is
vinculada con
that
dos,
related to
dos indicadores que creo que son muy importantes
two
tener en cuenta,
indicators
extraídos justamente de este documento de los
extracted from this document from
la tasa
CECLAC,
de fecundidad, cómo han evolucionado,
the
y la esperanza de
fertility rate and the life expectancy at birth, comparing two distant years in time, so that we can see the structural transformations from 1950 and 2024. In terms of fertility rate, the number of living children per woman, is clear that in the general trends, this rate has decreased to less than one half in the world average, have had different evolutions because have different starting points. In developed countries, this is much more evident, especially in the case of developing countries. And it's very important to consider the data related to Latin America and the Caribbean, that with 5.8% rate of children alive per woman from 1950, we have 1.8 children alive per woman in 2024. This is a significant change that goes together of how the expectancy of life at birth has grown comparing the same periods, where we've been a lot of progress in favorable terms, expanded the life expectancy at birth in all the regions, and in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, have moved from 48.6 years of life expectancy at birth in 1950 to 76.1 years in 2024. We're talking about data that are quite significant that should be taken into consideration. But there's another element that I think that is extremely relevant, that is that related to what has been called the demographic bonus in Latin America. If you look at this graph from the ECLAC document, shows how country by country we have year of the demographic bonus from 1950 to 2050, but in any case going beyond 2050. This idea of the demographic bonus, once again, it means the positive relationship between active population and inactive population, that is between the population between 15 and 65 years versus those under the age of 15 plus those over the age of 65, and shows us that there are countries where there still the possibility that this demographic bonus offers are still very significant and expand up to 2050, such as the case of Bolivia or Haiti. In others, it's much more reduced, and in some, this demographic bonus has been closed, such as Cuba, Chile, very soon in Uruguay, also very clear in the case of Colombia, that have closed that period, and Brazil. And this is important data because it tells us if we took advantage or not of this possibility with the demographic bonus at its time, and that, of course, most of the cases we were not able to take advantage as an asset to provide sustainable and including development. And in that regard, going back to my presentation, I will say that it is clear that this data proposed by this document, it updates the information on these topics. It doesn't make sense to insist in information that we all know, but to look at the different inequalities and the topics related to all the challenges that we have with aging, social exclusion, vulnerability, etc., in each one of these aspects. But the truth is, this is what we're talking about in all senses. If we make a step further, we should need to take into consideration more concrete data in terms of situation, going directly to the topic of building public policies with a generational perspective, with a generational
Por un lado, asumir que las condiciones de vida de las
to assume that the
generaciones
living conditions of the different generations are relational and situated social constructions in time and space, and not simply age groups to be considered from the comprehensive point of view. This is a fundamental data that needs to be taken seriously and tells us that we need to have this as a north among our priorities. Consider that there are two major sets of public policies: sectoral, what we do in health, in education, in housing, public safety, etc., and transversal, what we do in terms of training of human resources, knowledge dissemination, communication strategies, and so on, or in attending different population sectors. Thirdly, remember that in public policies, it is as important to work with each generation as it is to attend the existing relationship between them. This is a fundamental principle. And like any public policy, those of the different generations are a responsibility of all public institutions. These are four core principles to analyze these topics in more depth as we are proposing in this collective dialogue space. A further step to mention that there are important in terms of building public policies. The existing literature leads us to differentiate two major spaces, one with specific spaces for a population sector, for some specific working area, and on the other hand, what we call the transversal perspectives that try to integrate and coordinate. The specific spaces are for the youth, for the elderly, for the original peoples, etc. And they promote cohesion inside, but they complicate that cohesion outwards. So the relationship with different population groups we are focusing our look. And though they pretend to integrate, many times they reinforce social isolation. We don't have the space to provide the evidence, but in any case, there are lots of accumulated literature that reach this type of conclusions. The transversal perspective allows the construction of particular identities, but in a relational perspective. Children, boys and girls, related to adults and the elderly, women of original peoples in their relationship with other men from other cultural identities and so on, and allow us to promote actions assuming the existence of power relationships. The feminist groups propose to work more in building specific spaces for women to try to provide a gender perspective in public policies, are telling us that there's an equal distribution of power between men and women, and we need to work more in that regard. And that is quite relevant in all the areas where we want to work. Similarly, we can say that there's a consistency and inconsistencies in all the dominant approaches. In this case, there are some consensus in identifying the two major groups of approaches. On one side, we have the risk approach, and on the other hand, the right-based approaches. While the risk approach tries to prevent risk or address the consequences, the basic idea of right-based approach is to ensure the full enjoyment of rights for everyone. While in the risk approach work only with populations at risk, the rights-based approach tells us that we need to work with all the members of different generations. In the risk approach, the different generations are simply recipients of public policies, while in the rights-based approach, those who make up the different generations are
actores estratégicos
strategic
desarrollo.
actors
Y
in
creo que en ese
development.
sentido también hay
And I think in that
distancias
regard,
muy fuertes que tener en
there are
cuenta
very strong
a la hora de
distances or
estas
gaps to need to
materias.
consider in this subject.
Y si vamos directamente al
And we go
tema
directly
en
to the
que estamos
topic
tratando,
that we are
habría que hablar de que en términos de
talking today.
cómo
We
habría
should
que
talk,
sumergirse en el tema de las desigualdades
we should deep in
e
terms of
intergeneracionales,
intra and intergenerational inequalities by identifying distances and intersectionalities,
reales como posibles o
both
potenciales.
real as potential.
Ya hemos dicho, y esto lo
We've
hemos
mentioned
incluido en muchos análisis
already
realizados
and included in many analyses with your institution, social inequalities are by definition multiple and cumulative, including among the most relevant income and or class inequalities, but also gender, ethnic, territorial, and generational inequalities. Traditionally, much more attention is paid to those linked to income, somewhat in relation to those linked to gender, ethnicity, and territory, but very little and rather poorly to those existing in generational terms. Something quite evident when you analyze any national development plan or any of our countries. But fundamentally, only exceptionally are these various cumulative inequalities addressed from the approach of intersectionalism, which allows us to identify specific situations of particular concern. Among them, we may highlight child abuse, teenage pregnancy, youth violence, abandonment of the elderly. The gender differences cannot be understood and addressed in isolation without identifying the existing relationship between generations. We think that there is a very important area to work. Something that may be illustrative, the investment in health by age group and gender by OECD countries. These are highly industrialized countries, but this can be reproduced very similarly in the rest of countries, in particular in Latin America. As you can see in this chart, although gender differences are not that strong, although in some of the measures they are, in some age groups specifically, the generational differences are very important. The curve, with exception of those under the age of 1, from the first year of life to the 70 years, the curve is very close to the baseline. There's very few investment, but from there it starts to grow, and the investment in health is overwhelmingly accumulating those over the age of 75, 80, and more. Specifically in terms of those over the age of 90. So that means that there are public policies that lead to this to happen this way. And it's just not just a reflect of the aging of the population, because in that case, this is something that you always take into consideration when you do the analysis in these topics. And the explanation that is offered is that in general, the health policies are concentrated in the care of diseases and trying to extend the life of a person for some weeks or months at the end of their life as something of priority, with a lot of support from the investment in technology that helps with that type. Intensive care units, the complex surgery, and so on, that lead us to things to occur like this. WHO has calculated in many of these countries, they invest so much in the last 15 days of life of a person, as similar to the first 15 years of the initial lives of a person, which shows that the distribution of resources for health investment in terms of age groups and generations is quite different. You need to ask, we need to ask ourselves why, and try to see how can we improve these things. And that is things that we're going to still need to work in all of
En un
these
caso particular,
situations.
está muy en discusión,
A particular case that is under discussion in regards to the youth,
trabajar con un enfoque de
if
juventud
it's
o es más pertinente
youth
trabajar con
focus or
perspectiva de género.
generational
Hay
perspective.
mucho
There
debate
is
sobre esto, hay muchas
a lot of
afirmaciones en ese
debate,
sentido.
a lot of literature.
Una esquemática, síntesis nos podría decir que mientras en el enfoque de juventud,
While in the youth approach, it assumes youth as part of the so-called life cycle, the ageism that Dr. Calle mentioned, the generational perspective assumes the general population of a life course with the trajectories. While the youth approach, it is based on a human rights perspective, integrates gender and generations. The generational perspective starts from a relational perspective and from situated youth conditions. So it's not a issue of principles, but also with situation, with concrete realities and issues. The youth approach demolishes myths and stereotypes and makes them visible in a positive way. We don't talk about that either. And the generational perspective also assumes the existence of diverse perspectives in society by age, ideology, political posture, etc. So it's not just say that we have some denominations of myth that we need to avoid, but also to explain why they exist and what is the impact and how they affect these type of things. The youth approach promotes youth protagonisms. Youth are present and not only the future, something that is repeated over and over in recent decades. The generational perspective also recognizes the existence of power relations, gender, but also generations. It's a fact that the power in our society is in the hands of the adults and not the youth. And there's a fundamental issue about the idea that it's not only to claim and protest, but also analyze what that position exists and how can we work that the youth is not only the future, but is the present. And the youth approach is a working approach, but also an ideological perspective. On the other hand, the generational perspective says, rather than articulating efforts and proposes to integrate approaches and cleavages in real processes. It's not just to say this approach that I'm proposing is the right one, but also to say, well, in the society, we have different types of approaches. We need to see how can we integrate them adequately in pro of the rights of the population. The youth approach encourages the allocation of specific resources to youth, while the generational perspective focuses on public policies and the allocation of resources that actually exist. As we're going to see soon, we need to go beyond to allocate more resources to the young generations, which each generation does for itself. So we need to try to see how that can be done. So I would say that while the youth approach proposes several things of what to do, the generational perspective tries to put emphasis on how to do it, showing a relevant position. And this exercise could be done with other generational groups with similar results. To conclude, I would say the following. I think that there is a need to say we're having serious problems, serious issues, complex issues, and specifically related to the intergenerational aspect. But we need to remember that we have context constraints to be centrally taken into account. Just a few examples. We're going from globalization to deglobalization. There are new protectionisms, transnationalisms, new power blocks. We could organize all type of webinars about this type of things to look in more depth. We're going to denialism of climate change to the widespread neglect of the environmental agenda and beyond future global priorities. And we are not aware of this issue. We're going from neoliberal to neoconservative approaches, discourses and practices of hate, reconversions of the right, cultural dispute. we see that in all of our countries.
Estamos pasando de la inserción
We're going from international financial insertion to the return of war economy, armed production and sales. We just need to look to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or the war at Ukraine and Russia, and to go to those figures that indicate that the budget to defense in the European Union has tripled in the last 2 or 3 years, to be aware of what this means, because that takes away resources for social development. In our countries in particular, we're going from attempts at economic diversification to re-primarization of our economies, extractivism, fossil fuels, etc. During the colonialism, the assets were gold, silver, but now we have serious problems of what we're going to do with lithium. Something important for countries like Peru, like Bolivia, Chile, in the north of Argentina. So there are serious issues in this matter that our countries, in terms of promoting more integration, they are focusing more in soybean, livestock, together with these issues related to minerals. We're going from restricted democracies to return of messianic and authoritarian leaders with the corresponding institutional delimitation, something extremely important. And I think, and this is something important for the dynamic of public policies, we're going from the minimal state promoted by neoliberalism to the protective and controlling state with more neoconservative approaches. And we're going to from more or less state and or market to better markets and better states. And that this is extremely important to consider for the future. Authors have insisted in this type of things, and I think that this is important to take into consideration. A remark that I think that synthesizes these things by the Secretary General of the United Nations at the 2020 General Assembly, but is still current and have other more current formulations, but this is quite relevant, and it's almost 5 years that it was stated, and we think that things are not changing. I am here to sound the alarm, said Gutierrez at that moment. The world has to come out of its lethargy. We are on the brink of an abyss, and we're heading in the wrong direction. Our world has never been more threatened or more divided. We are facing the greatest cascade of crises in our lifetime. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified glaring inequalities. The climate crisis is battering the planet. Turmoil from Afghanistan to Ethiopia to Yemen and beyond has thwarted peace. A rise in mistrust and misinformation is polarizing people and paralyzing societies. Human rights are under fire. Science is under attack. And economic lifelines for the most vulnerable are coming too little, too late, if they arrive at all. Solidarity is conspicuous and is by its absence just when we need it most. This is a call that is the core to our effort and summarizes the current state. What are the challenges? And we conclude with this. Well, we need to provide a general perspective to all public policies. This is a major goal. Our experience are not working in the void. They're not small or specific or pilot programs, but instead they can be effectively things at large scale where public policies reflect and back up this type of initiatives. How to do it? To favor the adequate treatment of the particular agendas in the national local development plan by adding generational perspective in planning.
cosa que no
for
ocurre
example,
mucho. Los
something
planes
that
de
doesn't
desarrollo
happen
han ido incorporando
frequently in our
perspectiva de género, pero no
areas.
perspectiva generacional. Hay que hacer otro tanto en el presupuesto general del Estado.
To do the same in the general budget of the state and or municipality,
En la asignación de
with
recursos.
adding generational perspective in the allocation of
Hay que
resources.
estar atentos al discurso
We need to be
público de
attentive to the
muchas
public
autoridades
discourse of the main
nacional
authorities regarding
para
the
evitar
generational,
inconsistencias
in order to avoid inconsistencies between all
El
these
Plan
levels.
Nacional de Juventud puede decir que
The National Youth Plan may say,
elaborado por jóvenes puede decir que los jóvenes
drafted
son
by
el
young,
presente,
the
presidente de la
youth is the
República
present,
puede
and
decir
the
en un discurso
president
ante
of the
su
country
Congreso o Parlamento
during
que
the
los jóvenes
Congress can
son
say
y
that the
estaremos
youth are the
en
future,
consecuencia
so
gravísimas.
there will be serious
Hay que
inconsistency.
diseñar los planes
We
nacionales
need
y
to
municipales
design the
con
national and municipal plans with the people,
fundamentalmente
but
con
also
todas las
and fundamentally with all the institutions
no es solamente
operated in this field,
de sociedad civil, porque
not only of the
si
civil
las instituciones no
society.
participan,
If the institutions do not
esos
participate,
reclamos a sociedad civil pueden caer en el vacío y
that
generar sobre todo
can generate
frustración para quienes
a lot of
participan en
frustration for
los
those who participate in those
Y hay que fomentar el
participative
involucramiento de las
process.
diferentes
And we
generaciones
need to
en
encourage
todas
the
las áreas
involvement
del
of the
desarrollo
different
nacional y
generations in
local,
all areas
y no solo en
of
las
national and or local development,
algo que
and not
pocos
only of those directly linked, something that
efectivamente
we don't
los
do
países de
in our countries.
¿Cómo se relaciona esto con el tema
How it is related with the
Bueno, dos
youth
palabras
policies?
creo
Well,
que son
two
las que
words.
resumen un poco de qué estamos hablando.
This
¿Sí? Planteadas en términos de preguntas, evidentemente,
We-
porque creo que eso es más lo que tenemos que
this
estudiar
is
son
more in
preguntas
terms of
que
questions
respuestas
because we
políticas.
have more
Sí.
questions than answers.
Cuando hablamos de perspectiva
When we
generacional,
talk about
políticas
generational
públicas,
perspective in public health policies,
digamos, ¿qué perspectiva tenemos? ¿Qué
what is
percepción
our
tenemos
perspective?
nosotros,
What is our
los
perception?
legisladores, en general, estas cosas? ¿Las políticas públicas de salud tienen perspectiva generacional?
Do the public health policy have a
No,
generational
en buena
perspective?
medida, en
Yes,
ciertas
no,
cosas, en otras
to some
no.
extent.
Una gran pregunta que hay que hacerse.
It's a major
Dichas
question.
políticas públicas
Do such
solo reflejan las desigualdades
policies
existentes en la
only
sociedad,
reflect
o
existing
también las
inequalities in
refuerzan
society,
las
or do they also
Esa es
reinforce
otra
or
pregunta
diminish them?
fundamental.
This is another
¿Estamos
fundamental
respondiendo
question.
ante un problema externo
We are responding to
o
an
estamos
external
contribuyendo
problem,
a que
or we contributing to
mantenga
that
y
problem,
consolide
maintains
en muchos
and
aspectos
consolidates
las cosas que hacemos? Otra
with the
gran
things we
pregunta a
do.
responder colectivamente. ¿Son
Another
el
major
resultado de
question.
factores biológicos,
Are the
o sea,
result of
como se estudia
biological
efectivamente los
factors or are
determinantes sociales de
social
salud,
determinants of
como
health taken into account,
la OPS y muchos otros
such as
organismos
PAHO
internacionales?
and other international
Si las
institutions
desigualdades
propose?
generacionales inciden en el
If
acceso y la calidad
generational
de la salud,
inequalities affect
¿cómo se
access
puede
and
encarar
quality of
a
health,
futuro?
how can they be
Otra
addressed in the
gran
future?
pregunta en ese sentido.
Another major
¿Cómo se
question.
podrían atenuar las desigualdades
How
en el
could
salud?
health inequality
¿Solo
be
atenuar las
mitigated?
vinculadas al ingreso
Only by
o hay que
mitigating those links
todo
to
tipo
income,
de las
or do
desigualdades
we need to add
hemos mencionado
all
reiteradas?
these consideration of multiple
En
inequalities?
particular, uno podría
And in
preguntarse
particular, you
cómo
could
son
ask
las
things about
percepciones
what are
sobre
the
la perspectiva
perceptions
generacional
on the
en el
generational
caso
perspective
del personal
among
de salud,
health
un actor
personnel,
central desde todo punto de vista en estas materias.
a core
También
actor
con
in
un
this
conjunto de preguntas que son
subject,
muy relevantes.
with a
¿Qué
set of
percepción
relevant
tiene el
questions.
personal de salud
What
en relación a la
perceptions do
perspectiva
health
generacional?
personnel have on the generational
Dichas
perspective?
percepciones son el reflejo de las
Are these
políticas de
perceptions a
salud y
reflection
todo
of
el
health
desarrollo.
policies or of
¿Son
other
solo el
factors?
resultado de las políticas de recursos
Are they
humanos
only
o
the
algún
result
otro
of
factor?
human resource policies or some other factors?
Asumiendo que las relaciones
Assuming
interpersonales
the
son preocupantes, ¿cómo
intergenerational
se pueden
relations are
tratar
of
de
concern,
resolver?
how can they be addressed in
En el
public
diálogo
health?
concreto, cotidiano,
In the
del personal de
daily
salud.
dialogue of
¿Cómo
the
se podrían
health
mejorar
personnel.
dichas percepciones?
How
Solo
could
con
such
formación más
perception be
pertinente
improved?
y
Only
oportuna.
with more relevant and timely training?
Todas, reitero, preguntas
All
que
these
debemos responder
questions are
colectivamente a futuro en todos
need to
nuestros
be
espacios de
responded
trabajo,
collectively
y que
in
deben
all
ser
our
centrales
working
desde todo punto de
spaces
vista para que
and
lograr
are
el
core
objetivo
to
central,
any
o sea,
perspective to
es
achieve this
tratar
main
de
goal, to is
ponerse
to
como gran objetivo la
try
incorporación de
to
perspectiva generacional
incorporate
al conjunto de las
generational
políticas
perspective
públicas y en
to the set
particular
of
a
public
las
policies,
políticas
in
públicas.
particular to those related to
Una
health.
invitación a tener en cuenta
An invitation to
algunos
take
textos que
into
son
consideration
importantes para
some
seguir en estas
important
materias,
readings
que creo que son
that I think
sumamente relevantes,
that are
los
extremely
textos
relevant,
mencionados,
the
están
one in
todos
the
disponibles
slide,
en internet.
that are available in the internet,
Nuevos desafíos
from
para
age to
la
age,
perspectiva de las edades,
a new challenges for
las
understanding the
desigualdades en
service
clave
ages,
generacional hoy en
the
Mexico y
generational inequalities
Centroamérica.
today in the Latin American and Caribbean
Políticas
scenario,
públicas y
public
perspectivas
policies and
generacionales,
generational
que bueno,
perspective
aparece
reflections
por otros
in
colegas,
and from Latin America and the
especialmente de
Caribbean,
América Latina y el Caribe. Y el documento que ahora se
and
está
the
presentando
document that is now
justamente
being
en
discussed
Cartagena de
in
Indias,
the ECLAC
Población,
in
Desarrollo y Derechos Humanos en
Population
América Latina
Development
y
and
el
Human
Caribe.
Rights in Latin America and the
Segundo
Caribbean,
informe sobre la
second report
implementación del
on the
Consenso
implementation of
Continental sobre
Montevideo
Población y Desarrollo.
Consensus on Population and
Por cierto,
Development.
en estos precisos momentos se está
Certainly,
presentando
at this
también en
moment,
Cartagena
in
el informe
Cartagena,
mundial
being presented
sobre
the World
políticas de
Report
desarrollo del Fondo de la Población
on
de Naciones Unidas correspondiente
United Nations Population Fund 2024 that also has many elements related to these topics that will allow us to look into more depth these topics in the future, but always has to be done collectively. And with this, I close something I said at the beginning. If in a context where we are in at a time with a silent individual, we need to bet for a collective process. Only in that way, we will move ahead, we will make progress, and we can achieve transformations that are fundamental so we can have inclusive, sustainable, democratic societies. The Horas Konu, I think, is fundamental. Together we're stronger, together we go even further. If I'm not mistaken, as I am quoting it, I believe that that is the key. We need to avoid the siren song that the problems and difficulties of the alarming situations are going to be solved individually. We can only do it collectively, and that needs to be promoted from all points of view. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you
estimado
very much, dear
sociólogo Ernesto. De verdad, una excelente
sociologist
reflexión,
Ernesto,
conferencia.
a wonderful
Y sí, y dijo la
presentation.
frase del organismo andino
And you
como,
mentioned the
juntos
motto
somos
of
fuertes,
the
juntos llegamos
institution,
lejos.
together we're
Dr. Acayo
stronger,
siempre lo dice,
together we go further.
igual
That
que
Dr.
hoy.
Kai always insists.
Y solamente me gustaría resaltar
I
algunas
would just
cosas
like to
de
highlight
esta
some
sesión
things
que
from
nos
your
presenta
presentation
un panorama
that
bien
shows
completo
us
de los
a
desafíos y
very complete
oportunidades para promover este
landscape
diálogo
of the
intergeneracional.
opportunities in
Todo
promoting
esto
this
se ha dado a
intergeneration
consecuencia
dialogue
de
and to
crecer
build
en
more
América Latina y
inclusive and
Latinoamérica
fair
también.
societies in Latin America and throughout the
Desde
world.
esta perspectiva
From
generacional,
this
es
generational
esencial
perspective,
para
it
diseñar
is
e implementar
essential
políticas
to
públicas
develop and
para la
implement
salud. Creo que es
effective
una tarea que
public
todos
policies for
tenemos,
health, which is a
así como
task that we
también
all have,
desigualdades en salud
as well
de las
as the
diferentes
health
generaciones.
inequalities
Es un
among the
problema
different
complejo
generations, and a
que
complex problem
requiere desde un enfoque
that
integral
requires
que considere
a
las
comprehensive
determinantes
approach
de
that
salud,
considers the
las
health social
necesidades
determinants,
específicas de
the
cada grupo
specific
etario y,
needs
por
of
supuesto,
each
las
age
relaciones
group, of course,
intergeneracionales.
and the intergenerational
Y también es
relationships.
necesario fortalecer
And
la
also we
formación de
need
los
to strengthen
profesionales de
the
salud
training of health
en
professionals
perspectiva generacional
in
centrada en las personas para que podamos
generational
brindar una
perspective,
atención de
focus on
calidad
people so we can
a
provide a
personas de
quality,
todas las
good
edades.
quality care for all
Les
people at all
quiero
ages.
mantenerse
So
a
please,
los
could
ponentes
you
en la sala.
stay in the
Me han
room?
llegado muchas
We've
felicitaciones,
had many
comentarios y preguntas
congratulations,
muy interesantes
comments, and interesting
que las
questions
responderemos luego de
that
este
we will
pequeño
respond
agradecimiento y
after
saludo a
these
todas las personas que están
small
conectadas.
greetings to all the people who are
Entonces,
connected.
tenemos personas conectadas desde los ministerios
We've
de
had people
salud,
joining
desde la
from the Ministry of
academia,
Health,
desde
from the
diversas entidades e
universities
instituciones
and
sociales,
different
de
social
algunos países
institutions
conectados,
in some
Angola,
countries
Argentina,
such
Brasil,
as Angola,
Chile,
Argentina, Argentina,
Chile,
Brazil,
Colombia,
Bolivia,
Cuba,
Chile,
Ecuador,
Colombia, Cuba,
España,
Ecuador,
Estados Unidos,
Spain,
Honduras,
United States,
Guatemala,
Honduras,
México,
Guatemala,
Paraguay,
Mexico,
Perú,
Paraguay,
República
Peru,
Dominicana,
Dominican
Uruguay
Republic,
y Venezuela.
Uruguay, and
Hemos
Venezuela.
recibido
We
muchísimos
have
saludos y
received
felicitaciones,
many
así que muchas gracias para
congratulations
quienes
and
conectan.
greetings, so thank
Y
you
bueno,
for all
dicho
of
todo esto,
speakers.
ahora sí me gustaría
Now
iniciar el
I would like to
espacio
start
de
the
preguntas. Hay
Q&A
preguntas muy
dialogue.
interesantes para los
We have
dos.
very interesting questions for
He
both of
recibido
you.
muchísimas. He tratado
I have
también de
received,
consolidar
I've
las
tried to
dos
consolidate
preguntas para cada uno, porque
two
creo que hay
questions for each
mucho
one of
interés en
you
este tema
because
que,
there's a lot of interest in this
aunque
topic.
ambos han
Although
mostrado que tienen
both of
años
you have
trabajando en
shown
este
that they
tema,
have
creo
years
que
working in this topic,
está un poco
I
invisibilizado
think
y
that
poco
it was
trabajado
somewhat
en la agenda
invisible
pública de
and work in
manera
the public agenda
frecuente en diferentes espacios,
present
diferentes
in many
campos
spaces
laborales.
and different
Entonces,
working fields.
quisiera iniciar las
So I
preguntas
would like to
con
start
Dr.
the
Matthew.
questions with
Entonces,
Dr. Matthew.
para usted la
Dr.
siguiente
Matthew,
pregunta.
for you, the following
Entonces dice,
question.
¿cómo
It says,
podemos adaptar
how
las
can we
redes
adapt
intergeneracionales
the
a los
intergenerational
contextos
networks
locales para
to the
promover el
local
intercambio de
context
historias
to
y
promote
experiencias entre
history and
generaciones?
experiences exchange among
Además,
generations?
más allá de las redes de trabajo,
And beyond the
¿qué otras
working networks,
estrategias
what other
pueden implementarse
strategies
para
can
fomentar
be
el intercambio y la
implemented
colaboración
to
entre
promote
generaciones
exchange and
en cada
collaboration
comunidad?
among generations at a community level?
Okay, thank you. That's a pretty big question. Well, being that I'm an interventionist at heart, I love such questions because it really does get at the essence on what community life is all about. How do we get people to share their stories? to talk about not only history, the older adult history, but also the history being made in the daily life experience of young people and what they care about. So there are many different models for that. Just to start with that piece, there's a whole active world. They talk about reminiscence interviewing. How do you actually interview someone who has a long life experience? Different ways to facilitate reminiscence and to record it. Sometimes putting it online, sometimes a short report, going into a library. If we're talking about in the context of building community and community context, I think we could probably do better in terms of raising up these stories and what people learn and integrating it into other ways of learning. So for instance, we have schools where people learn about history. How do we integrate people's daily life experiences and insights into courses on history? Also, how do we facilitate dialogue where people talk about the community, where it's been, what it's like now, what we would like to see it in the future, the temporal component of community change. What can an intergenerational lens, the question is, what can an intergenerational lens contribute to that? And I emphasize an empowerment framework. I think if you get people talking, an age-diverse group, first they talk about me, their own life, and then they hear about you, the others, the other generation's life. And the challenge is the we. How do we want to live? What do we want to do? Oh, we want cleaner water. So, gee, maybe we can work together and do water quality management. Or we care about the need for policies to address global climate awareness and facilitate climate action. So there are programs, there are ways to develop action whereby people are going together into legislative bodies, the political world, and sharing their generational perspectives and their ideas for what can be done, taking action to make sure that action is taken. Anyway, hopefully that addressed the question a bit. The power of the lens, the action, and I talk a lot about this field being, last point, the integration of inquiry and practice. So on one hand, we have the studies idea, a field of studies that belongs in the university. But the world I'm in is looking at ways in which the university and community intersect. You bring these two continents together. Yes, some people are studying the relationships between generations, but how can we leverage the understandings and insights on that to get people to study the issues, talk about intervention strategies, and work together to make communities more friendly, safer, healthier, and places where people can gather and get to know others and support each other. That's the essence of the field, in my opinion.
Muchas gracias, doctor.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yo también
Matt.
agregaría
I will also add
un pequeño comentario desde la
as a small
experiencia
comment from
latinoamericana, los
the
diálogos
Latin American experience in the dialogue of knowledge. Those dialogue of knowledges in this intercultural approach have facilitated to learn about the experience of indigenous and original people and to generate this dialogue with spaces such as the universities or managers at different institutions and fields. So I think that I will add that to what has been mentioned you as strategies for this super important and interesting question and how to apply it in our region. Now I have a question for Ernesto. I've tried to summarize it. I have two questions in one. It says, the intergenerational gaps, are they associated with the increase of the fake news that we see in social networks? How does this affect the sustainable development? In addition to how can we approach negative emotions in the public discourse from the intergenerational point of view and to promote a constructive dialogue among generations?
Bueno, interesantísima
Well, very interesting
las preguntas, la síntesis.
questions.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you for
Imagino
synthesizing
que
them.
ha habido muchas
I'm sure
particulares en torno
that
al
there are
mismo.
many questions similar to those ones.
Primero sobre los bulos. Es un tema que toqué,
With the fake news,
que no
something that
toqué
I
prácticamente en mi
didn't
presentación, y es
include in my
sumamente relevante,
presentation,
más
but is
genérico,
quite relevant
de las
in a more
tecnologías,
generic
las
in terms of
transformaciones
technology
que están
in the
habiendo
technological transformation in our countries and throughout the globe,
y cómo inciden en estas materias.
and how they affect these matters.
En particular, está muy en debate hoy en
In
día cómo
particular,
incide la
we're
robótica
debating
en
the
temas
incidence of robotic
transformaciones en el mundo del trabajo,
in the
cómo
transformations
incide
in
la
the
inteligencia
working
artificial
group,
en
how
relación
AI
hasta dónde vamos a ser sustituidos
influences how
por
much are we going to be
máquinas
substituted by intelligent
seres
machines
humanos,
as human
cosas por el
beings,
estilo.
and
Y
things like
esos
that.
temas están teniendo mucho más
And those
relevancia
topics are having more relevance in
ahora
what has
predominante
been
que
so far a dominant topic,
con la dinámica de las redes sociales, etcétera.
which is social networks dynamics. I think that
hasta ahora, y aunque permanece en
up
estas
to
últimas
today
décadas,
and
globales y
in
también
recent decades in the 21st century, in particular,
una incidencia
we've
enorme
had
de las noticias falsas,
an
de las portadas,
enormous increase in fake news
y eso ha generado, yo
and
creo,
similar things, and that has generated two types of phenomena that reinforce the isolation
pasiones tristes de las
and the sad passions that Dubet mentions,
el individuo tirano, etcétera.
the tyrant individual, which is the idea that social networks
fueron construidas
were built
para que nos pudiéramos comunicar
for us to communicate, and actually more horizontally in actually what they have done through to the monopolization of social networks, the major technology companies, these networks have tended to generate bubbles to get together with only the ones that are like us. So whoever am I or whatever am I, each one in particular, so has tended to reinforce self points of view in many opportunities, and that has been very skillfully used for more conservative sectors. Networks have been used to misinform, to prevent people to be concerned for relevant topics and use their time in trivial things, in nonsense. And I think that that has also had a tremendous influence in manipulation. Once you build the profiles of certain population groups around the information that we offer in social networks about our characteristics, preferences, tastes, and discrepancies, etc., and hates, I think that that has generated a very powerful tool in the hands of those who control it. It has been used for evil, for worse. It has reinforced isolation, have reinforced the gaps among groups, has reinforced the struggles, the type of answers, the hate discourses, discriminatory practices, and so on. So I think that there is a very relevant incident from all point of view. We could talk about hours, but I think that to respond to the question, I think that that is tending to be permanently incorporated and going to have less incidents. There's more awareness of the limitations of social networks, and there's less acceptance of criticism for social networks. So we have more capacities to identify lies, fake news, mechanisms of manipulations, etc. It's not generalized, but we are improving in that area. So that's giving more relativity to the incidents in these matters. However, I think it's very important what we see with AI and robotics. There we have major problems from many points of view. I just read a book that didn't impress me with the title, but I was more interested when I started reading it. It's a book called The Political Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence. And I think it's very relevant because at the end, what this reflection from the political philosophy allows us to see how AI is not just a technological subject or issue. It's not just to know how to do work with this from the technology point of view, because AI is also reinforcing discrimination, hate discourses. AI is tending to learn what they collect from the networks, and therefore it reinforces these existing mechanisms. And when we look at that reinforcement, we can see that because we all grouped in different bubbles, that leads us, that has negative consequences. Similarly, we can say that robotic is acquiring a brutal incidence in the loss of working positions without offering the responses of creating new ways of work. So these are two important topics. And I mention all of this because it is relevant, but also the incidence that they have in public policies and in health public policies in particular. In the world of public health, it's a whole issue how we incorporate robotics and AI to the dynamics and health policies. Today, robotics allow us to perform surgery with robots. Now AI allows us to transmit value in terms of what health means and quality of life. And all is that becomes a major challenge that goes beyond the fact that we add AI to have better tools for administration, management of health policies. We need, in general, our human resources training that do not integrate these different looks. I told my children, and they both work in technology, information technology. I said the issue is that in your training, you've never had the minimal contact with philosophy matters. And I share this book with them, and we are actually discussing all these topics. For those who work in generating algorithms and robotics and AI, those who are working in this, that they have not only training in practical terms only of the software of this tool, but also have training in many other dynamics. And I think that the same is also valid for the health personnel. It's very relevant that this type of topics be worked as it's being done in this webinar in a much more systematic way, and also add other subjects, because it is extremely important that we can work better in the future. And that is valid for public policies. It's also valid for the experience in the daily work, which are very relevant, such as the one that Matt has shared with us and many others. And I coincide with you, Yadira, in the importance of dialogue of knowledge of indigenous people in Latin America. I think that it is vital to take this into consideration, to continue learning, trying to limit the historic structural trend to hyper-specialization of the health personnel. The fact that a surgeon specialized in specific surgery or similar things. My impression is that we need health personnel that's more polyvalent, that has different and convergent looks in these issues, and in that regard, it is extremely important to consider that we're having all this process in the context that affects us, in particular these things related to artificial intelligence and robotics, but also that the state is back, but it's not the same state. So we are in the process where the public officials need to be looking at this process in a more comprehensive way in order to avoid falling in simplicity that is not going to get them too far along. I think that the commitment that we ask to the health personnel should consider these transformations and things that have central impact in the health personnel, and so on. I don't want to expand more because of time, but that's my answer to this question. Thank you very much. Dr. Matthew, would you like to add something to the question I asked Ernesto? Because this is a question that's so wide and goes across many states. Similarly, before giving you the floor, I'm going to read the following question. And if you want to comment on the new question, you're welcome. This is a dialogue, so okay, this is more a dialogue. So, Dr. Matthew, the question here is that I also tried to summarize, because it's part of the experience that you share with us. You mentioned that we could say that there's been a loss of respect to the cultural heritage of these indigenous people, such as the ones you share in different parts of the world. So you have the space in the floor. Go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, I think the question about respect for indigenous cultures and societies ties in with the question about history. And how do we know our history? How do we respect it, and so forth? So I think so much of the dialogue about aging societies is painted negatively, like it's going to cost us more. We have fewer working age people, putting money to cover health and social, to cover the health and social security needs of older adults. I mean, so it's a conflict. It's almost like it's not a family, it's more of a conflict. So an intergenerational paradigm takes a lifespan perspective and respects history, what came before, alternate perspectives. So in fact, that was really the beginning of Generations United. They were fighting against ageism and stereotypical negative attitudes towards age and diversity, other kinds of diversity as well. So how do we develop these integrative strategies, and going forward? So just thinking about one case I learned about like 30 years ago. There was a school, I think it was in Arizona in the US, learning about different cultures and so forth and history. And one of the Native American tribal leaders was invited to go to the school and share perspective and history. But the school said no. The school board, the supervisors, they said, no, where's his credentials? So, I mean, it's a debate about who has the credentials to share history and different perspectives. And it's very interesting that raises up to the debate. And since then, there's been more social change, more awareness that we need to pay attention to what different societies, different age groups, different cultures have to offer. And even dealing with modern issues, in terms of pollution, in terms of climate change, and even in terms of changing technologies, even talking about like threats, like false fake news. That was a conversation that just came up. AI, how do we know it's real, and so forth. So many times we segregate generations to learn these things and take action, but from a lifespan perspective and from an intergenerational perspective, the dialogue and the ideas for intervention are amplified when you bring people together. So for instance, a question about cybersecurity. There are all these programs to help older adults save their money and not give in to these, these terrible scams. And then at the same time, there are some scams using technology aimed at young people that are soliciting them for social relations, totally inappropriate and totally illegal. So they learn these things separately, but imagine if we take an intergenerational perspective, have them learn about scams and security, cybersecurity together, about how during the lifespan and during our history, there's always been scams. There have always been people taking advantage. So how can we together learn about different angles on using technology to keep people safe, and to make sure that some of the negative unintentional consequences of AI, people are made aware of it and they learn to doubt it and not embrace it. So I think that has to be a full, not just one generation, not just not the political class or, and so forth. I mean, I think that has to be a broader discussion. And I do think people can take great grassroots effort, grassroots action, going to the bodies of political decision-making, and we see that. But it's more effective when you just don't have youth. People say, oh, that's charming. But when you have adults and older adults joining the youth and fighting for change and, like cleaning up toxic dumps and actually, looking at our energy use, where they vote, adults and older adults vote. And it's a very strong block, for creating change, and I have many examples of practices like that and projects like that. So I know I've morphed away from the indigenous knowledge angle, but just one more thing. It's not only about learning about the other, but it's learning about ourselves. So if we learn that we've taken a deaf ear to someone else's struggles and trials and tribulations, it's not only what we learn about them, we're learning something about ourselves. We're learning to listen better. We're learning to be more open and less quick to jump to conclusions about others. So from a human development point of view, these kind of engagements are valuable. And also from a community and social change perspective, they're valuable. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Matthew.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. Because of time issues, we have very interesting questions that I'm going to send you via email. It's a public commitment I'm making. I would like to ask you that use 1 minute. You could give us a final, very summarized conclusion about the challenges that we have to approach this intergenerational gap, and how can we guarantee the active participation of generations in the development of public policies that have this look of intergenerational perspective. In 1 minute. Dr. Matthew, you go first, and then Ernesto.
I'm going to time myself, make sure I don't violate the rules. I won't be invited back. Well, I, for one, am optimistic. In the midst of all these like macroeconomic, political, international strife that's going on, I see people wanting to take action. And I see the intergenerational field as not solving everything, but I see it's a body of intervention strategy, a lens for achieving social change, for moving towards ways to help solve it, maybe on a smaller level, but they bubble up to larger scale for really good models. So I think, it's exploding. People it's not just bringing generations together, but in significant ways this solves problems. If people are scared, if they're getting mugged on the way to school, there are solutions. There are like seniors walking them to school. I mean, we can actually solve problems if we lean in it together to do so, but we need to involve the bookend generations more so than they typically are involved. So, but there's a field that's happening, it's exploding. And all we need to do is just read about it and start our networks and take action. That's my minute. Thank you.
Así es, muchas gracias.
That was 2
Adelante,
minutes, sorry.
sociólogo.
Yo quisiera resumirlo en una consigna o en una...
I would like to summarize it in one global proposal where we are working in Latin America more in one country than others,
haciendo algo, que es el tema
but they're
de
doing something which
el
is
desafío
the challenge
construir sistemas de
of
cuidado.
building care systems.
Y las dos palabras son muy importantes.
And the two words are very
Sistemas nacionales
important.
de cuidado, sistemas locales,
National
sistemas
care
de
system, local
protección
care
concreta, después
systems.
se puede hacer más específica. Centrar la atención en el cuidado implica,
This
digamos, tener
care,
una mirada humanitaria.
this type of care requires a central look of human rights and start from the basis that it needs to be, has to be the priority. And I think that that's extremely relevant. And it has to be systems, because it's not enough to have programs for care for children or for the elderly or for women who are exposed to abuse. We need systems that can coordinate those different dimensions of care. And there, the intergenerational is fundamental. If you consider how generations of Central Americans, for example,
se centran en que
are focused,
digamos, unos habitantes
that some
quieren emigran a Estados Unidos para poder buscar
migrate to the US to look for better alternatives for their lives, and they leave their children with their grandparents to care for them. And there is an very particular intergenerational relationship. In many other aspects, we see the same. If you look at the information technology, you see how indeed children teach their grandparents many things related to how we manage technology and so on. But I think that the core is how can we have impact in public policies. For that, we need to work more in programs of overcoming poverty or similar things that all countries have, is to set up comprehensive systems of care, and there to work with intergenerational perspective, and of course with gender perspective and ethnic perspective. But generations are key, working together, which is the central idea of this webinar. I think that is one of the keys. And we need to rethink this type of topics. Wonderful. Well, with these messages, we thank all the questions raised. We were not able to respond them, but we will consider them to define topics for the next webinar. We value your participation and interest, and of course, we thank for the excellent presentations and for this enriched debate to Dr. Matthew Kaplan and sociologist Ernesto Rodriguez. Thanks to all the participants of the Horas Konu team and to all the people who participated in this activity, which has been possible thanks to the commitment with the Andean and Latin American integration. I give the floor to Dr. Marisela Malki, Deputy Secretary of the Andean Health Organization, Hippolyte Non-Agreement. Go ahead, Dr. Malki. Thank you very much, Yadira. I will start by thanking Dr. Matthew and our dear friend Ernesto, who had the opportunity to have him before, and for dedicating this time to talk about a very important topic, so current, such as the generations working together, living together. As Mari Carmen mentioned, there are 5 generations living at the same time in the world, and that is reflected in all our lives. For example, in our institution, we have 4 generations working together, and we are convinced of the importance that each one of has and the interrelationships they must have in order to work together and generating intergenerational programs in order to try to respond to the needs and the challenges of each one of these groups. You mentioned the intergenerational collaboration, and the most important is to learn how to listen and how to make the different generations participate in all types of fields. Speaking about health, it was mentioned that health inequalities among the different generations are a complex issue that is going to require a comprehensive approach considering these health social determinants, the own needs, and the most important that has been highlighted, which are the intergenerational relationships. It is also important to work among these generations in order to detect their problems and also to facilitate common goals and to find common goals and therefore develop common agendas. We have seen how the budgets in countries are allocated for the final portions of life, and that perhaps when we start to look inside of the evidence, they're going to be more equitative. Human resources for health are also important when we consider the training to have this intergenerational perspective so they can care for all the groups that have different needs, different situations. In that regard, once again, we thank you to our excellent speakers, to all who have contributed for the successful development of the event, Yadira, Rob, Ruby, and all who have been behind stage, and mostly to our audience that week after week follow us in these webinars that we have been more than 4 years. And I would like to invite you for next Thursday, July 11, at the same time, to look at racism. We look forward to see you again. Once again, thank you and see you soon.
Thank you.